Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome here at Innovate for Climate. We are going live from Frankfurt, and I'm here with Hartwig Schafer and Hans-Peter Lankes from the World Bank Group. So to make a difference in climate, we all know that we need to bring in between $5 and $7 trillion every year to build up infrastructure and other assets in emerging markets. And if we are building them, we might as well build it green. And we know that this would take public and private sector working together to make it happen. So Hart, why don't you tell us what does it mean to maximize finance for development when it comes to climate action?
Thanks, Alzbeta. Let's dial back 3 years when we met in Addis Ababa at the Finance for Development conference. At that time, we realized that over the next 20 years, we will need official development assistance, but it will not be enough. Public money will not be enough. So there were two things that were agreed at that time in Addis. One was we need to make sure that domestic revenues are mobilized. The other one is we need to make sure that we bring in the private sector. And this is something that the World Bank has picked up following the G20 conference in Hamburg last summer, where there was an endorsement of bringing in the private sector and private finance and development finance. For us in the World Bank, that means that we are actually bringing all three parts of the bank together, IFC, Hans-Peter's unit, MIGA, and the World Bank. And we are asking a question when there is a project, can the private sector do it? If the private sector can do it, we should let the private sector do it. And that always goes making sure that there's value for money, that it's sustainable with regard to environment, social, and economic criteria. But if the private sector can make it under those circumstances, let the private sector do it. In most cases that we are operating, the private sector will not be able to do it without additional work. And this is where the World Bank comes in. We are helping create an environment so the private sector can be active. And that means working upstream on policy, on regulatory environment, but may also mean that we apply some of our instruments to de-risk the investment. And only if all that fails, we should use public sector money. The result is that a country can use its scarce public resources to where it is needed most and let the private sector take on investment projects where the private sector is able to do it.
Excellent. Thank you, Hart. So Hans-Peter, what does it mean? How do we crowd in private sector capital to emerging markets, especially for climate?
Yeah, and it's a good point. As Hart explained, in many cases, there's going to be the need to prepare the ground with public sector action for the private sector to step in. And at IFC, we've done a study in 2016 of opportunities for investment linked to the implementation of the NDCs between now and 2030, and the numbers are quite staggering. We come up with $23 trillion worth of investment opportunity. Now, much of that opportunity has to be worked on, has to be prepared, and this is where this maximizing finance for development approach comes in. Give you an example. In Africa, clearly we know that there's a big job to be done on connecting individuals to electricity. At the same time, we want power to be provided in a way that is sustainable in the longer term. Africa has significant solar potential, but you see very few investments in that area. And the reason is that institutionally it's often difficult, it can be very time-consuming, markets are very small, and the risks are high. In the case of scaling solar, which is an initiative that the bank group has undertaken, we have worked to provide a kind of one-stop shop for solar power project delivery, starting with the regulatory framework for that, with the offtake agreements that are required, with the risk mitigation that is necessary to bring private players in, and then the auction mechanisms. We're now working in 4 countries, in Zambia, Senegal, Ethiopia, and Madagascar. In Senegal, there was a recent closing of an auction, which came in at 4 euro cents a kilowatt hour, which is the lowest energy costs of any in Senegal at this point. So it is possible to structure these deals to get the private sector in and provide very competitive energy, that as a result of the combination of public and private sector action.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. We recently celebrated 6 cents a kilowatt hour in Zambia, and we just beat it in Senegal at 4 euro cents, right? Excellent. So, Hart, we know that countries have committed to do certain things in climate agenda through the nationally determined contributions as part of the Paris Agreement. How does the World Bank take that into account when you are thinking about country strategies, and what support will you give to countries to develop green infrastructure and other assets?
Well, in the World Bank, we are really following the country's priorities. And it all starts with a country engagement through a systemic country diagnostic, looking at where are the binding constraints. In some cases, this may actually find constraints in the legislation, the policies that prevent the private sector to come in infrastructure or in climate smart infrastructure. This then is translated into a partnership framework that determines how the World Bank is engaging over the next 5 to 6 years. And we have a number of facilities that actually bring the NDCs and the investment needs together. One of those is to look at every project and make sure that we are maximizing the climate co-benefits, that we are looking at the design stage, what can we do to actually be more low carbon, to be more resilient, enhancing than what would be the default. And this is something that is really taking off. There is a demand for it from the countries. And to give you a couple of examples, just last week we took a project to the board for India. This is actually going to cover half of the NDC commitments for India through an energy efficiency project where the World Bank is providing support to switch to LED lighting, to have street lighting that is low carbon, that is very high in efficiency, to make sure that we bring in the private sector through one of our guarantee products. The same thing is happening in Indonesia as we speak. Indonesia is a country with the highest potential around the world for thermal energy, for geothermal energy. But the private sector is not coming in because it's very risky upfront. So we are providing a facility to de-risk the upfront cost, to make sure that there are at least 20 exploration sites for geothermal that will, at the end, deliver 1 gigawatt of geothermal energy. And it is through the support, the knowledge, through the resources of the bank that the country will actually exploit that potential that they have.
You're touching a very important point, Hart, that this is sometimes quite risky. We know that renewables in many countries have been de-risked already, but there are still a number of areas that are quite risky. So back to Hans-Peter, what are the tools that IFC and others have been using to de-risk some of the investments, especially the new areas such as battery storage and others? What are the tools that we have at the disposal that we can help private sector come into those areas and start investing?
Well, the first tool is of course, IFC's support for project preparation. In order to make projects bankable, we have a variety of abilities to do that, and then to take a risk on IFC's own book. So in the last fiscal year, IFC financed a little under $5 billion worth of climate change projects. We now have a target to drive that up to something between $15 and $20 billion annually by 2030. So that's an ambitious agenda. That is IFC's own book. Then we want to leverage this up. We want far more because we all know this is about trillions. It's not just about billions. In order to do that, there are the traditional syndication platforms that the IFC has that allow other financing sources to come in alongside the IFC. But that is usually not enough to tap institutional investors where the very deep pockets of money sit. And for those, there have now been a variety of new platforms that have been created. One platform is the MCPP, Managed Co-Lending Portfolio Platform of the IFC, in which IFC and donors, in the first case, this is SIDA from Sweden, take a first loss tranche which de-risks the senior tranches and makes it possible to have investment grade in assets for pension funds and institutional and other institutional investors. That is one instrument that we have. Another instrument is in the in the green bond market, where we've progressively moved into more ambitious schemes, and the last one that was recently agreed is the Amundi what is it? Emerging Green One Fund, which works both on the supply and the demand side, bringing institutional investors together in a kind of marketplace with emerging market banks that finance and then provide assets into that pool. And again, there is a risk mitigation dimension with IFC and some others taking subordinated tranches. So those are mechanisms that are under construction.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. So there is a whole toolbox to de-risk some of the climate finance flows going to emerging markets. So Hart and Hans-Peter, both of you have spent quite a bit of time in development finance. What would be great to hear from you is the advice that you would have to yourself as a 25-year-old starting in development finance and wanting to go to climate finance in emerging markets. Any thoughts, Hans-Peter?
Do I look much older than that?
No, you're just about 25.
What is my advice? I think this is one of the most fascinating areas you can be in today. There's a huge challenge. Anyone who's motivated by more than sort of just the day-to-day job, this is a real mission. You can have a mission here. There is innovation, technology comes in, solutions are being developed every day. You can work on those, and you can do something for development. And the combination of these, for me, this is an area with a vast range of different possibilities. Go there, young girl.
Go there, Hart. What would you do?
Well, for everybody who is 25 or 25 at heart, we have been talking over the last 10 minutes about projects that are in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But the most brilliant ideas that I have seen in my assignments around the globe were really something that took maybe a couple of thousand or $10,000 of investment. Whether it is creating your own NGO that is helping in the Upper Nile to preserve the Nile banks, the riverbed, or whether it is working with solar energy to actually bring light to a remote village, or whether it is using climate-smart agriculture and working with farmers to create an income for a family on cash crops and allow them to not only help us save the planet, but also provide a livelihood for the family. Those are some of the brilliant ideas that I think we are looking for, and then we can take those ideas that are coming from some of the most dynamic youth and scale them up at the national level.
And you have to say, I mean, you can come from all sorts of different backgrounds. You're an engineer, you can work on solutions, you're an anthropologist. Well, we have to transform societies. You are an economist. There's work to be done in finance. So all these disciplines come together. There's room for many of us.
In climate, so technology, disruption, innovation, economics, finance, all together. So Hans-Peter and Hart, thank you very much for joining me here today, and we'll continue building climate markets in emerging markets of tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.